Good morning, everybody. Glad to see everyone here. We're going to be starting off this morning in Daniel chapter 6. And for those of you who have been in church for some time, you've probably heard this story a lot of times. It's the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And a lot of times, what comes to mind is the kid story Cliff Notes. We know that Daniel wasn't allowed, or the people weren't allowed to worship anyone but the king for 30 days, and Daniel did it anyways because he was faithful to God, and because of that, the people who wanted to stop him and bring him down twisted things and had him thrown into the lion's den, and God protected him, shut the mouth of the lions, and he came out safely in the end. And a lot of times that's the majority of what we remember from that story. But I want to look a little bit more into the mechanisms of how this played out and what was at work here. Who was involved? How did they do this? Why did they do it? Verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. So King Darius, and remember back in this time, this is during the Babylonian exile. This is in Babylon. This is during his reign. It was probably around 500 BC, give or take 20 years or so, during the reign of King Darius. And we know in the past that that major portion of the world was ruled over by one empire or another several times. The Greeks, the Romans, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and this was during the Medo-Persian reign. And King Darius wants to set up a system, a network of leaders to rule over this entire kingdom. So he sets up 120 of what they call satraps. If you look up what a satrap is, a lot of times the definition it gives you is something akin to a governor of some kind. But in this case, we know that there are 3 governors above them, so maybe like lieutenant governors, I don't know. So there are 120 of these people to rule over the whole area, the whole kingdom that this Medo-Persian Empire has control over, and above those 120 people is 3 men. And those 3 men will report directly to the king. So we got King Darius, we got 3 guys, and then we got 120 below them. And among those 3, one was Daniel. And these people had to answer to Daniel and these other 2 men, so that the king would suffer no loss. Basically, he wanted to make sure that everything was covered. This was a big area. This wasn't just one little country. He wasn't just ruling over Germany or Italy or Israel. This is a massive area and a massive undertaking, so he needs help. And in this hierarchy of people, Daniel, it says in verse 3, then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. And think about that. 120 rulers, 3 rulers above them, and the only step up from there is king. And one of these 3 governors, being Daniel, has set such a wonderful example and done such a good job that the king's thinking about just putting him in charge of everything. How do you think people would respond to that? How do you think these people who have some power are going to feel about giving up some of that power, or answering to someone who is more good and godly and a more honest ruler than perhaps they are, than definitely they are, as we're going to see. Let's see how they react to that. Verse 4, so the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Here's this good and godly man doing wonderful things, and some people are going to lose a little power over it, and so they're conspiring together to find a way to trap him, to find a way to end his ability to continue on doing these things. It's kind of mirroring Jesus' story a little bit with the Pharisees. They didn't like what they saw. this godly man was making them look bad. They wanted to stop him. But because of his integrity, because of his godly nature, they couldn't find any fault. It says they tried to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. Now think about that. Because of his faithfulness to God, they couldn't find any earthly charges, any charges among their kingdom, because he was a man of integrity. There was no fault found in him, he said. And so they had to find a different way. They had to come up with something different to trap him. They had to come up with something different to cheat him out of this power and out of this position. Verse 5, then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Well, that's curious. We can't find anything he's doing wrong legally. We're going to have to find a way to trap him because of his faith. We're going to have to find a way to stop him in a legal earthly sense based on what we know he's going to do because of his faithfulness to God. Could you imagine being so faithful to God that people can predict what you're going to do because it's God's will? I wish people could predict what I'm going to do just because it's God's will. So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. Uh-oh, they're buttering me up. What do they want? They're coming to butter up the king. King Darius, live forever. Oh, you're so great. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, the satraps, the counselors, the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, Daniel's on our minds because we're reading the story of Daniel. But this is a king over an entire kingdom. And maybe Daniel's not in his thoughts as he's thinking about the implications of this. All he's thinking is, wow, everybody loves me and they want to worship me. Everybody wants to put me above anyone else who might be worthy of worship, God or man. So they butter him up, they deceive him. Verse 8, now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore King Darius signed the written decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since the early days. And there are a couple things in that verse that I'd like to notice. When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home and did this. He didn't just mistakenly do something willy-nilly that he didn't realize was against the statute. He knew the risks. He knew the consequences. He knew that there was a den of lions at stake, and then decided to go home and do it anyways. That's how committed to God's will he was, that they were able to predict it. They knew that his faithfulness wouldn't let him turn against God just because his life was at stake. But I think it's also important to note that at the end, he says that he prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. He's been doing this all along. This is a consistent faithfulness. He didn't just say, oh, well, they're trying to take away my ability to do this. Well, now I'm going to start doing it. And I think a lot of times in this world, Christians don't get serious about things like their faith until there's a threat against it. And honestly, I believe some of the most passionate Christians in the world are the ones who are living in places where there's a threat for doing so. There's a legal threat. They might be killed for it. And it makes them double down on their commitment because they need to lean on God even harder. just as Daniel knew he needed God. I think of kids who never play with a certain toy, but the second somebody else wants to play with it, and it might take it away, and now that's the most important thing to them. No, that's mine. I'm hanging on to that. And I don't think people realize that there are legitimate threats of this, even here. Satan's got people at work just like God does. And yes, we are blessed to be able to be in here right now without threat of penalty of the law for now. That could very easily change. And people have tried. And people in other countries have succeeded. Go ask a pastor in Canada what he can and can't talk about without being arrested. 2014, less than a decade ago, the mayor of Houston tried to subpoena transcripts of all the sermons of the local pastors because he wanted to make sure that he wasn't saying anything offensive or discriminatory. And thankfully, in 2017, their governor signed an act to protect pastors from things like that. But there are legitimate risks. There are people who want to do things like that. There are people who want to set us up knowing, like these governors and satraps knew, that a lot of people are going to remain faithful to God despite what that says. And we're trying to lay a trap for God's people. Is Satan's MO. It's his people's MO too. We need to be on guard for it, and we need to fight it off, because if nobody does fight it off, they're just going to be able to run on through with it. And it'll progressively build and build worse and worse. So he went home and he prayed. He gave thanks to God, as was his custom. And then, these men, verse 11, these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? And the king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. You see what they did there? They didn't start off by saying, hey, we caught Daniel doing this. Didn't you make this law? They haven't even brought up Daniel yet. They're saying, didn't you make this law that nobody can do? Yeah, I did. It's kind of like when somebody calls you and says, hey, do you have any plans Saturday? But don't say why they're asking. That's a trap. Because you say, no, I don't have any plans, they're going to say, good, I need you to help me move to Kentucky or something. Maybe, why? No. But they're setting him up. He's affirming what they're saying before they give him a chance to realize why they're saying it. They're not making it as obvious to him that this was a setup. Didn't you say that? Didn't you say they should be cast in the den of lions? Yeah, he says this thing is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Uh-oh. He's just confirmed, I can't change this. If they come to him and said, well, we caught Daniel doing this, what about this law? He might say, well, I don't know, maybe I can do something for him. But he just said, no, this doesn't change. Once it's made a decree, it's a decree. He's stepped into this trap that he's helped them build. So they answered, verse 13, so they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set in his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored until the going down of the sun to deliver him. He loved Daniel. And Daniel was a very important person to him. He was a very important person to the kingdom. You know, he was doing so many wonderful things that he was looking at getting the most power in the kingdom short of the king. And it killed the king that he had been sucked into this trap. He set his heart on him to deliver him. He labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. He He did everything he could. He was probably going through any legal document he could find, trying to find some kind of loophole, probably consulting people to advise him legally. Is there any way around this? How can we do this? And he fought until the going down of the sun and came up with nothing. Verse 15, then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So, we know you're trying to do something about this, but hey, it's concrete. Once you make that, that's how our system works, king. I mean, you knew that. You knew that going into this. Sorry, but this is just the way it has to be. Verse 16, so the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. And I want to think about that for a second. He says, your God. He didn't say my God. He didn't say our God. He said, your God. This was a pagan people. There were a lot of gods there. They weren't real gods, but they were worshipped as gods. Not the true God, but these false gods. And the king likely didn't worship the one true God either. And here he is in this moment of desperation, crying out to Daniel, your God that you serve all the time, that God you serve continually, he is going to deliver you. And it makes me think of how people who can in this world can deny God until they're blue in the face. But when push comes to shove and there are desperate times, they cry out to him because deep down they know he's real. They know he's out there and they know they've just been avoiding him. And he's confident. He's scared. He doesn't say, hopefully your God will help you. Pray to him just in case it helps. He's saying, you know what, that God of yours that you're so faithful to, he will deliver you. He's probably thinking, man, if God can save anybody, why wouldn't he save Daniel, this man that's so faithful that people are trying to bring him down, this man that's so faithful that we see the good in him and we want to elevate his status. Then a stone, verse 17, then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. At this point, he's in there. He's trapped in there. They've sealed it. Can't be broken. And now he needs to see how the Lord's going to provide. Verse 18, now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. This isn't just somebody who's losing an employee. He's desperately anguishing over this. This king who everybody gives the best of the best to. Everybody gives him the best foods and the best entertainment. And he doesn't care about those best foods. He's fasting for the night. He doesn't care about these musicians. He wants to be left alone. He can't sleep. It sounds like he's in the midst of a depression. Because although he's spoken confidently that God will protect Daniel, he hasn't seen the results yet. He can't see what's happening under that great big stone. He can't look down there and see whether or not Daniel survived. And a lot of times that's how we are. We can be confident in God, but when we can't see what's really happening, we get scared. We might get desperate. We might get depressed. We might not want to eat. We might not be able to sleep. Even though we have that confidence, God will get me through this. When we can't see what's happening behind the scenes, when we can't see what God's working, it can bring a fear that can lead to a heart like he seems to have here. Verse 19, and the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. He popped up and took off and headed down there to see what happened. Verse 20, and when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Is he able? Was he able to? Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." I wonder whether he saw that angel. I imagine it's very possible he did. In my mind, when I picture the scene, I picture him seeing this glowing angel holding the mouth of the lion that Daniel sees and has confidence in. But it's also possible that the lions just stayed back and kept their mouths shut, and he knew that God's hand was in it, and that's how it played out. But imagine the peace it would give you once you realized that this lion is staying back and keeping its mouth shut. Imagine how much more peace it would give you if we could see that angel holding his mouth. And that's the thing. How much more peace do you have when you can see what God's doing? It's the unseen that we worry about. It's the things that are taking longer than we expect, or the things that God is working in ways that we don't expect. So we're not looking, we expect God to do this to fix our situation, but maybe he's doing even better things over here. So we're too busy looking over here to see what it is that he's really working. And he brings up an excellent point here too. They haven't hurt me because I was found innocent before him, but also, king, I've done no wrong to you. Even though these people suckered you into making this decree, I haven't done anything against you. I just kept serving my God and worshiping my God just like I always have. I didn't do anything against you. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him, verse 23, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. Something that sticks in my mind, thinking about Daniel and his situation, is the fact that we have such a need today for people in leadership positions that are godly men and women. We have such a need for people with godly morals and godly values and just truly godly people to take leadership. And so many people who are opposed to God will argue, no, we don't want to do that because we don't want them forcing their values on us. Did Daniel do that? Did Daniel say, you know what, I'm in charge, and because of this, you're all going to go to your rooms and pray? He was faithful to God, and he was faithful to his position, and the things that he did were good things that made the kingdom better, that made life better for the people. And that's why he was in a place to be promoted. These people hated God. And because of that, they hated what Daniel stood for. And they hated the idea that he would be in a higher position than them, in a position to possibly bring an end to the wicked and corrupt and ungodly things they were into. I mean, between the governors and the satraps, that's 122 people that conspired together crookedly to have an honest man killed. How much more corruption might he have upended and stopped through them? We talked this morning about Jeremiah's struggles with the wicked prospering and how God would ultimately bring justice to that. And we don't always see that, but we see it in their story. Verse 24, and the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions. Them, their children, and their wives, and the lions overpowered them, broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came into the bottom of the den. These lions were hungry. These lions didn't let Daniel live just because they were already full that day. And King Darius wrote, verse 25, to all people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. This pagan king leading over pagan people is worshiping the one true God because one man refused to let the people's hatred of God get in the way of his faithfulness. Could you imagine if every Christian today lived like that and what impact it might have? There are people in countries around the world that if they openly express their faith in God, they could be killed for it. There are people around the world in some countries who may lose their property or have their families arrested because of that. But there are people who, on the opposite end, will keep their mouth shut because someone might be offended, because someone might not like what they hear, or someone might think a little less of them. Someone might think, oh, they're crazy. But what happens when you hold tight to that faithfulness regardless? This wasn't just somebody saying, all right, everybody in my town, we're going to start worshiping God. This was the vast majority of the civilized world. This was many, many kingdoms combined into one massive earthly kingdom, and he's making a decree that this is the real God. There weren't any idols down in there. There weren't any wooden statues down there propping open the mouth of the lion so it couldn't bite Daniel. He knows that it was only Daniel's God, the one he was faithful to, the one that he proved his faithfulness to, the one he was committed to. I want to have a commitment like Daniel. I want to be committed to God in a way that when whatever lions life throws at me, he'll shut their mouths before they even have a chance. People need to know what these people found out. People need to know about the one true God. People need to know that that true God came here as Jesus to save us from our sins, to save us from the kind of wickedness he was surrounded by. You don't have to be as faithful as Daniel to be a Christian. But man, that's something to strive for. I've never had my life put in danger for my faith. I'd like to think if that happened, I would remain faithful. Jesus was. His life was in danger. He could have said, you know what, it's close enough. That thing's scary. But he stayed faithful to us. Even though we're not always faithful to God, he's always faithful to us. He took it all the way to the cross to take our sins to the grave, to take us to heaven. We need to remember that when life starts throwing lions at us, when it starts throwing decrees like this at us. It might not be a law, but what is it out there that is trying to sway you away from your faithfulness? That's trying to sway you away from your commitment to God. We need to stay on our knees in faithfulness to God and trust that he's going to, just like he shut the mouths of those lions, he'll shut up those situations in our lives and bring us home to safety.